Thank you, Chair Murkowski, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. When the federal government shuts down, our trust and treaty and legal obligations do not vanish, but they are put at risk. Promises to provide health care, housing, education, and public safety, among so many other critical services, are all on the chopping block. Communities are scrambling to secure alternate or reserve funding just in case their federal funds fall through, and several tribes have already declared states of emergency due to the funding and service shortfalls. And it's not the first time. In 2018, we learned just how devastating a government shutdown is for Native communities. A few examples: general assistance payments for food, clothing, shelter, and utility needs of low-income Native individuals and families were suspended. Funding for foster care and long-term care for children and elders suspended. Funds for tribal operations suspended. During that shutdown, the president of the National Congress of American Indians, Jefferson Keel, warned us that, quote, "Indian country cannot afford, and America should not stand for another one." But here we are again. We're on day 29 of this government shutdown, on track to being the longest on record. And that is nothing to brag about, especially because it's no ordinary shutdown. This time, it's also on track to being the most damaging to federal workers. Rifts are happening right now across the federal government that are choking off funds and services promised to Native communities. As we speak, the Office of Indian Education staff at the Department of Education are receiving their RIF notices.
Okay, so picture this. You're sitting at home, scrolling through your phone, and suddenly the Capitol goes into full lockdown mode. Security teams are scrambling, lawmakers are freaking out, and why? Because someone just dropped a bomb. Because a whistleblower, someone with direct ties to the Trump family, just leaked documents that could blow the lid off one of the biggest political scandals we've seen in years. Yeah, this actually happened like 2 days ago. And before you roll your eyes and think, oh great, another Trump story, hold on, this one's different. This isn't some random accusation or political theater. This is an emergency response. This is Capitol security mobilizing like they're preparing for a legitimate threat. This is bipartisan lawmakers, people who usually can't agree on what day it is, coming together and demanding answers. Can you believe this? So what exactly got leaked? Well, according to reports from Reuters and Politico, we're talking about documents that suggest the Trump family may have had unauthorized access to confidential legislative material. Not just some random emails, not just some casual conversations. We're talking about congressional communications, the kind of stuff that's supposed to be locked down tighter than Fort Knox. And here's where it gets wild. The whistleblower didn't just dump these files and disappear. They apparently have direct connections to the Trump family, which means this isn't coming from some outside hacker or foreign agent. This is coming from inside the house. Let me say that again, inside the house. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Without these federal workers, Native education programs required by law could grind to a halt. It doesn't have to be this way. Punishing federal workers with pink slips is a choice. It is not a requirement under the Anti-Deficiency Act. It is not something that automatically occurs at the end of the federal fiscal year. This is a choice that has nothing to do with the fact that we are in a shutdown. This shutdown is robbing agencies of staff needed to carry out the trust obligations to American Indians, Native Hawaiians, and Alaska Natives. Native communities can't put federal funding to work or fully exercise their self-determination if their fiduciary, the United States government, is out of the office. Let me be clear what we're talking about here. Native programs are not DEI spending, they are not charity, they are the law. Attempting to cancel funds for Native programs, riffing more than 4,200 federal employees.
The Capitol security response was immediate. Like within hours, they had teams deployed, and lawmakers were being briefed on what happened. Reuters quoted sources saying the leaks could pose a direct threat to legislative integrity. That's not the kind of language you use for something minor. That's the kind of language you use when the whole system might be compromised. And look, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking this is just another political hit job. You're thinking the media is blowing this out of proportion. You're thinking there's no way the Trump family would be dumb enough to get caught up in something like this. But here's the thing. This isn't just media speculation. This is an actual emergency lockdown. This is actual documents. This is actual testimony from someone who was apparently close enough to know what was going on. AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, came out swinging almost immediately. She's calling for a public inquiry. She's saying this echoes previous scandals involving political families abusing power, and whether you love her or hate her, she's not wrong about the pattern here. The Ukraine call, the classified document situation, the constant questions about conflicts of interest. It's like, come on, how many times are we going to do this dance? And the public is eating this up. The hashtag Capital Emergency blew up on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it now. Over 500,000 mentions in just 24 hours. That's not organic growth. That's people freaking out. That's people sharing this story like crazy because it feels big, because it is big. Think about the timing here. We're heading into the midterms. 2026 is right around the corner. And suddenly the Trump family is back in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. Suddenly there are questions about transparency and privilege and whether political dynasties get to play by different rules than the rest of us. And here's what makes this story different from all the other Trump controversies we've covered. This isn't about what he said at a rally. This isn't about some policy disagreement. This is about potential abuse of access to the actual machinery of government. This is about someone or multiple someones possibly using their influence to get their hands on information they had no business seeing. The implications here are massive. We're not just talking about bad optics. We're not just talking about political embarrassment. We're talking about a fundamental breach of trust between the branches of government. We're talking about the kind of violation that makes people question whether our democratic institutions can actually function the way they're supposed to. And the fact that this is happening now, right as we're gearing up for another election cycle, makes it even more explosive. Because voters are already skeptical. They're already tired of the corruption and the scandals and the sense that powerful people get away with whatever they want. This story feeds right into that frustration. It confirms what a lot of people already suspect, that the rules don't apply equally. That if you have the right connections and the right last name, you can access information that should be off limits. You can operate in spaces where regular people would get arrested. So yeah, buckle up, because this story is just getting started. We've got a whistleblower who apparently knows where the bodies are buried. We've got lawmakers demanding investigations. We've got security teams treating this like a genuine threat. And we've got the Trump family right back in the middle of a firestorm. And if you think this is going to blow over quietly, you haven't been paying attention. Alright, so let's dig into what's actually happening here. Because the initial reports are wild, but there's a lot more going on beneath the surface. And like most people are missing the real story. First, let's talk about who this whistleblower is. Now, we don't have a name yet. Security and privacy laws mean that's being kept under wraps for now. But what we do know is that this person allegedly has direct ties to the Trump family. Direct ties. That could mean a lot of things. Could be a former employee. Could be someone who worked in the administration. Could even be a family friend who got too close and saw too much. But whoever they are, they didn't just stumble onto this information. They were in a position to see what was happening. They had access. They knew where to look. And at some point, they decided enough was enough, and they needed to come forward. And that's the part that should terrify people. Because it means this wasn't some outside hack. This wasn't a foreign government trying to stir up trouble. This was someone on the inside who looked at what was going on and said, this is wrong, and I need to expose it. Think about what it takes for someone to become a whistleblower. You're risking your career. You're risking your reputation. You're probably risking relationships with people you care about. You don't do that lightly. You don't do that unless you've seen something so serious that staying quiet feels worse than speaking up. So what exactly did they leak? Well, the details are still coming out, but here's what we know so far. The documents apparently show that members of the Trump family, and we're not sure which ones yet, may have been accessing congressional communications without proper authorization. That means emails, that means memos, that means internal discussions between lawmakers about policy and legislation. Can you imagine? Think about what that means. Congress is supposed to be an independent branch of government. Lawmakers are supposed to be able to have confidential conversations about what they're working on without worrying that someone from a political family is reading over their shoulder. And if this is true, if the Trump family really did have unauthorized access, then we're talking about a massive breach of the separation of powers. We're talking about the executive branch, or former executive branch in this case, potentially spying on the legislative branch. That's not just a scandal. That's a constitutional crisis waiting to happen. Now let's talk about the Capitol response, because this is where things get really interesting. When this news broke, security teams didn't mess around. They went into emergency mode. They locked down areas of the Capitol. They started doing sweeps to make sure there weren't any other security breaches. And here's the kicker. They mobilized bipartisan briefings. That means they brought in lawmakers from both parties and said, look, we have a situation and you need to know about it. When was the last time you saw Democrats and Republicans agree on anything? But apparently this was serious enough that everyone put their partisan nonsense aside for a minute and said, okay, we need to figure out what happened here. Reuters reported that sources inside the Capitol described the situation as a direct threat to legislative integrity. Those are strong words. That's not, oh, this is concerning. This could undermine the entire system. And you know what? Maybe it should undermine our confidence in the system. Because if political families can just access confidential government communications whenever they want, then what's the point of having rules? What's the point of having security clearances and protocols and all these safeguards we're supposed to have? Let's talk about AOC for a second, because her response here is actually pretty revealing. She came out fast and hard, calling for a public inquiry. She said this echoes previous scandals involving political families abusing power. And she's right. The pattern is there. Remember the Ukraine call? When Trump allegedly pressured a foreign leader to investigate his political rival? Remember the classified document situation? When boxes of sensitive material ended up at Mar-a-Lago? Remember all the questions about business conflicts and foreign deals and using government positions for personal gain? This is the same playbook. This is the same pattern of behavior where rules don't seem to apply and access gets abused, and then everyone acts shocked when it blows up. And look, I know Trump supporters are going to say this is all a witch hunt. They're going to say the establishment is out to get the family. They're going to say this whistleblower is probably some disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. But here's the thing. You can't fake an emergency Capitol lockdown. You can't fake bipartisan concern. You can't fake documents that allegedly show unauthorized access to congressional material. Either this happened or it didn't. Either the Trump family had access they shouldn't have had or they didn't. And the fact that Capitol Security is treating this like a genuine threat suggests there's real substance here. Let's also talk about the timing. Because yeah, the timing is suspicious as hell. We're less than a year out from the midterms. Trump's influence is still massive in Republican politics. Candidates are still seeking his endorsement. His family is still involved in political fundraising and organizing. And suddenly, this story drops that could potentially damage that influence. That could raise questions about whether the Trump family can be trusted with access to sensitive information. That could make voters think twice about supporting candidates who are too closely tied to this drama. Now, does that mean this is a political hit job? Not necessarily. Just because something is politically inconvenient doesn't mean it's not true. And the fact is, if the Trump family did have unauthorized access to congressional communications, that's a serious problem, regardless of when it comes to light. But it does mean we need to watch how this story unfolds. We need to see what evidence actually exists. We need to see if there are legitimate investigations, or if this just turns into another partisan food fight where nothing gets resolved. And here's where it gets even messier. The public response has been absolutely wild. That Capitol Emergency hashtag, over 500,000 mentions in 24 hours. People are sharing articles, people are posting theories, people are arguing about what this means and whether it's real and who's to blame. And that's exactly what happens in our current media environment. A story drops. It goes viral before anyone knows all the facts. People pick sides immediately based on their existing political beliefs. And then we all just yell at each other on social media while the truth gets lost somewhere in the middle. But underneath all the noise, there are real questions here. Real questions about accountability. Real questions about whether political families get to operate by different rules. Real questions about what happens when the people in power or connected to power decide the normal safeguards don't apply to them. And those questions matter. They matter because if we can't trust that our government institutions are secure, if we can't trust that confidential communications stay confidential, then the whole system starts to fall apart. So where does this go from here? Well, AOC and other lawmakers are demanding a public inquiry. That means hearings. That means testimony. That means a whole circus of congressional drama where people grandstand and ask pointed questions and probably don't get straight answers. But it also means we might actually find out what happened. We might get to see the documents. We might hear from the whistleblower. We might get real accountability for once instead of just watching another scandal fade into the background noise. Or, this could all just disappear. The investigation could stall. The documents could get classified. The whistleblower could get discredited. And we'll all move on to the next outrage while nothing actually changes. That's the cynical take. And honestly, given how these things usually go, it's not an unreasonable take. But maybe, just maybe, this time is different. Maybe the combination of insider testimony and documentary evidence and bipartisan pressure will actually lead somewhere. Maybe we'll get answers that matter instead of just more political theater. The question is, do we have the will to follow through, or are we just going to watch this play out like every other scandal, big headlines for a week, and then forgotten by next month? Okay, so let's break this down into what actually matters, because there's a lot of noise around this story. But here are the core points you need to understand. Point 1, someone with direct ties to the Trump family leaked documents showing potential unauthorized access to congressional communications. That's not speculation. That's what multiple major news outlets are reporting, based on sources inside the Capitol. Reuters, Politico. These aren't fringe conspiracy sites. These are established news organizations with reputations to protect. And the documents allegedly show that members of the Trump family, we don't know which ones yet, were accessing confidential legislative material. That means private conversations between lawmakers. That means policy discussions. That means the kind of information that's supposed to be protected because it involves the functioning of Congress. Why does that matter? Because Congress is supposed to be independent. Lawmakers are supposed to be able to do their jobs without worrying that political families are reading their emails or listening in on their strategy sessions. The separation of powers exists for a reason. And if that separation gets violated, the whole system is compromised. Think about what this means in practical terms. If lawmakers can't have confidential conversations, they can't negotiate honestly. They can't discuss strategy. They can't work through controversial issues without everything becoming public or being used against them. And if a political family, any political family, has access to those conversations, they have incredible power. They know what's coming. They know who's planning what. They can use that information for political advantage or personal gain. That's not democracy. That's something much darker. Point 2. The Capitol response was immediate and serious. This wasn't, oh, we'll look into it eventually. This was emergency lockdown mode. This was security teams mobilizing. This was bipartisan briefings where lawmakers from both parties got pulled into classified sessions to hear what happened. And that tells us something important. It tells us that the people in charge of Capitol security, the people who know what actual threats look like, took this seriously. They treated it like a legitimate crisis. They didn't brush it off as political noise. Reuters quoted sources saying the leaks could pose a direct threat to legislative integrity. That's huge. That's saying this isn't just embarrassing. This isn't just bad optics. This is potentially undermining the ability of Congress to function properly. And when you have career security professionals, people who aren't partisan hacks, saying something is a direct threat, you need to pay attention. The fact that this triggered an emergency response tells us the evidence is probably pretty solid. Security teams don't go into full lockdown mode based on rumors or weak allegations. They do it when they have reason to believe there's been a serious breach. Point 3. This isn't happening in a vacuum. The Trump family has been at the center of multiple controversies involving access and abuse of power. The Ukraine call, the classified documents, the constant questions about business conflicts and foreign deals. So when a story breaks about potential unauthorized access to government communications, it fits a pattern. It's not some random isolated incident. It's part of a larger track record of behavior, where rules seem optional and accountability seems like someone else's problem. AOC pointed this out when she said this echoes previous scandals involving political families abusing power. And she's not wrong. Whether you like her politics or not, the pattern is there. The history is there. And that's what makes this story so important. Because at some point, we have to ask, how many times are we going to see the same behavior before we actually do something about it? Every time there's a new controversy, we hear the same defenses. It's a witch hunt. It's political persecution. The media is biased. Everyone does it. But you know what? Not everyone does it. Not every political family ends up at the center of security breach investigations. Not every administration leaves behind a trail of scandals involving classified information and unauthorized access. At some point, the pattern itself becomes the story. Point 4. The public is paying attention. Over 500,000 mentions of Capitol emergency in 24 hours. That's not just political junkies and news nerds. That's regular people sharing this story because it feels significant. And in our current media environment, that matters. Viral stories shape public opinion. They influence how people vote. They determine which politicians feel pressure to act and which ones think they can just ride it out. So the fact that this story is trending hard, the fact that people are talking about it and sharing it and arguing about it means it's not going away quietly. This is going to be part of the conversation heading into the midterms. This is going to be something voters think about when they're deciding who to support. And for the Trump family, that's a problem because they've spent years building a brand around being anti-establishment and draining the swamp and fighting corruption. But if the story here is that they were the ones abusing access and violating the rules, that's a pretty massive contradiction. How do you run on cleaning up Washington when you're accused of being part of the problem? How do you claim to be fighting the deep state when you're allegedly using insider access to spy on Congress? The cognitive dissonance is wild. So what happens next? Well, lawmakers are demanding investigations. We're probably going to see congressional hearings at some point. There's going to be testimony. There's going to be document requests. There's going to be a whole circus of political theater. But beneath all that theater, there are real questions that need answers. Did the Trump family have unauthorized access to congressional communications? If so, who gave them that access? Was this a security failure or was it intentional? And what information did they actually see? Those questions matter, because if political families can just access confidential government material, then we don't really have a functioning system of checks and balances. We have a system where the people with connections and influence get to operate by different rules. And that should bother everyone, whether you love Trump or hate him. Whether you think he's a political genius or a dangerous con man, you should care about whether government institutions are secure. You should care about whether the people in power are following the rules, because today it's the Trump family. Tomorrow, it could be someone else. And if we don't hold people accountable when they cross these lines, then those lines stop meaning anything. Now, will we actually get accountability? That's the big question. History suggests we probably won't. These kinds of scandals tend to blow up. Everyone gets outraged. There are hearings and investigations, and then nothing really changes. People move on. The next outrage comes along, and the whole cycle starts over. But maybe this time is different. Maybe the combination of bipartisan concern and public attention and actual documentary evidence will lead to something real. Maybe we'll actually see consequences instead of just more talking heads arguing on cable news. I'm not holding my breath, but I'm also not giving up hope. Because here's the bottom line. The Trump family is back in the headlines for potentially abusing access to government information. A whistleblower with inside knowledge decided the situation was serious enough to risk everything and come forward. Capitol Security treated it like an emergency, and lawmakers from both parties are demanding answers. That's not nothing, that's a real story with real implications. And over the next few weeks, we're going to find out just how deep this goes. We're going to see if the investigations lead anywhere. We're going to see if the documents get released. We're going to see if anyone actually faces consequences. The cynical part of me says this will all blow over. The optimistic part of me says maybe this is the scandal that finally sticks. Maybe this is the one where the evidence is too strong and the public pressure is too intense for everyone to just look the other way. We'll see. But either way, this story matters. It matters because it's about whether our democratic institutions can function properly. It matters because it's about whether powerful people have to follow the same rules as everyone else. It matters because it's about trust. And right now, trust in government is pretty much at rock bottom. So stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. And if history is any guide, it's probably going to get a whole lot messier before it's over. The Trump family thought they could operate in the shadows. A whistleblower just turned the lights on. Now we'll see if anyone actually cares enough to do something about what we find. And that's the real test here. Not whether the allegations are true. We'll probably find that out eventually. The real test is whether we as a society actually demand accountability, or whether we just shrug and move on to the next thing. Are you kidding me? After everything we've been through, all the scandals and the controversies and the investigations that went nowhere, are we really going to let this one slide too? I guess we'll find out.